My name is Dolphinos, and this is my guide for patch 10.1 of Dragonflight, how to play Fury Warrior. Everyone knows Fury Warriors only want one thing, and that one thing is two big-ass swords. So with that, let's show you how to use them by getting into the talents. Starting with Mythic Plus, this is the primary setup I would be using for patch 10.1 once I get my tier set together. If you do not have your 4 set yet in patch 10.1, all you need to do to fix your build is drop this 1 point out of Cold Steel Hot Blood and put it into Ashen Juggernaut. Notable things you could change about this tree are dropping Seismic Reverberation in order to pick up a point in an Intimidating Shout is something that could be very valuable if you need the extra CC inside of keys. Outside of that, I really don't see the class tree changing very much. The other notable thing you could change is dropping Spear of Bastion to pick up Thunderous Roar, and you can also drop one of the points in Cruel Strikes if you want even shorter cooldown on your Thunderous Roar. This version would be more AoE focused and less single target damage, and could end up being better in keys overall. However, personally, I am a big fan of Spear of Bastion, because I think the single target it provides is just more valuable and will speed up keys more in the end. Alright, and now we are going to convert this into the build you will be using for most raid encounters in the next patch, and we're done. That's it. This is the same build you'll be running in Mythic Plus and Raid for the most part. Any raid fight that has an AoE component, you'll be using this build exactly. Now, to convert this to a more raid-oriented build for a pure single-target fight that has no AoE component, all you would need to do is drop some points out of these 2 Whirlwind talents and pick up both Hack and Slash and Ashen Juggernaut, and then you drop the 2 points in Whirlwind, and that's your build. This does make it so your AoE is very lackluster and kind of terrible, so I would really recommend only doing this on pure single-target fights, otherwise the point and improved Whirlwind and Meat Cleaver are just too valuable. And now with talents out of the way, let's get into the rotations, and also just how to play this spec in general, because we didn't cover that. This section of the video is going to be core gameplay principles of Fury Warrior. If you are an experienced Fury Warrior player and you're just interested in the rotational changes coming with the new patch, feel free to skip ahead to the next section. If you are new to learning Fury Warrior, let's get into it. So at a very basic level, Fury Warrior is a builder-spender class. You can see as I attack this dummy, my rage bar fills up, and once my rage gets over 80, my rampage lights up, and I can press it to spend my rage. That is the most basic level Fury Warrior operates on, and you'll be constantly filling and spending your rage bar. I believe the best way to understand the Fury Warrior rotation is thinking about things in terms of a priority system, so throughout this section of the guide, I will have this single target priority chart, where I list out what button you should be pressing at what priority level, and this will keep getting updated as we keep adding piece by piece. And at the end of this section, I will show the changes that you make to do the optimal AoE rotation. Now, to start getting into the actual abilities of Fury Warrior, we'll first cover our most powerful and only rage spender. That is one of the most used buttons in all of our kit, and that is Rampage. Rampage spends 80 rage and does an absolutely massive amount of damage, as well as granting us the Enrage buff. Enrage is an absolutely massive damage buff that we will keep near 100% uptime on using the builds I showed previously. And that really is what makes the build so powerful, is that you can keep Enrage up near 100% of the time. Rampage will be the #1 priority in our rotation. It is the only way we can spend rage and avoid overcapping, which is always bad for every resource generating class in the game. Rampage also just does an absolutely massive amount of damage. Using the builds I showed at the start of this video, Fury Warrior has access to 4 builder abilities. These are abilities that generate rage, those being Execute, Onslaught, Raging Blow, and Bloodthirst. Going one by one through these abilities, first up we have Execute. Execute does an absolutely massive amount of damage and generates an absolutely massive amount of rage. Unfortunately, it is only usable when the enemy is below a certain health percentage or we have a proc of sudden death. Next on the list we have Onslaught. Onslaught is a 12-second cooldown that does a large initial hit of damage, as well as refreshing our Enrage buff, which we showed before is very powerful, and generating 3 stacks of Slaughtering Strikes. Slaughtering Strikes just simply buffs up our next Rampage, and you don't really need to think about it or track it in any way, just know it's increasing your damage. Next up we have Raging Blow, which also generates 1 stack of Slaughtering Strikes when we use it. It does a mediocre amount of damage and generates a mediocre amount of rage, however it is still a substantial part of our damage overall. And last but not least we have Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst does the lowest amount of damage and generates the least amount of rage of all of these builders, however it is still more powerful than Whirlwind, and our tier set actually buffs it, which we'll discuss later in the video. As far as the single target rotation priority, the first builder you should press, if it is available to be pressed, will always be Execute, followed by Onslaught, followed by Raging Blow, and finally you would press Bloodthirst. There is one final builder that I did not mention before. Generally it doesn't get pressed in single target, but it can if every other ability is not available, and that is Whirlwind. Whirlwind does not deal a lot of damage, nor does it generate a lot of rage. However, it is a very key component to our AoE rotation. For the purposes of the pure single target priority, though, it comes in last place and will only be pressed if nothing else is available. Now, getting into the changes you would make to this for the AoE rotation, it is very simple. Part of the Whirlwind ability is whenever it hits an enemy, you gain 4 stacks of the Whirlwind buff, and it could be 2 stacks if you are not running Meat Cleaver talent, but in all AoE situations, it is a massive gain to run Meat Cleaver, and so we do it all times. So you will always gain 4 buffs of the Whirlwind buff, and what this does is make our next 4 abilities cleave to 5 mobs around us. And this is an absolutely massive part of our AoE damage. It is very important that every single global cooldown we spend in AoE situations has the Whirlwind buff up. This means that every 5th global in your rotation will be Whirlwind, no matter what. It is the #1 priority every 5th global if you do not have it up. If you do not have the Whirlwind buff and there is more than one target, you need to refresh the Whirlwind buff by pressing Whirlwind. Outside of that, the AoE rotation priority is exactly the same as a single target priority. And that is the end of the core rotation of Fury Warrior. Moving on, I'll be discussing how to use your cooldowns. When it comes to cooldown usage on Fury Warrior, it's actually a little bit complicated. Fury Warrior has 4 main cooldowns, those being Recklessness, Ravager, Avatar, and Spear of Bastion. Let's go through each of these one by one so you know what they do, and then we'll talk about how to use them. So first of all, we have Recklessness. Recklessness is a very simple buff. It just grants us 100% increased rage generation, absolutely pumping our rage bar, and 20% flat critical strike. Next up, we have Ravager. Ravager grants us a bunch of flat damage. It just does a ton of damage to enemies in front of it, generates a bunch of rage, and also gives us the stacking Hurricane buff. It takes about 3 seconds or so of Ravager being out for Hurricane to be fully stacked, and then it lasts 6 more seconds afterward. Hurricane just gives us a large strength buff, buffing our damage by quite a bit. These 2 cooldowns will always be used together. They share the exact same cooldown reduction through anger management and will always be synced up. Every time you press Ravager, you press Recklessness. Every time you press Recklessness, you press Ravager. They live together, they die together. Next up, we have Avatar and Spear of Bastion. These are the 2 abilities on 1 minute 30 cooldowns. Avatar just grants us a flat 20% damage buff and also frees us from roots and snares. And then we have Spear of Bastion, which just does a bunch of damage in a small area and tethers the mobs. Additionally, we have a talent called Elysian Might, which gives us a large crit damage buff for standing inside of our Spear of Bastion once we throw it. This is a very big part of our damage and very important to use effectively. It is worth it to hold Spear for a few seconds in order to be able to stand in it for its duration and deal maximum damage. Not using your Elysian Might buff will hurt your damage a lot on Fury Warrior and is one of the most common mistakes. These 2 abilities are ideally used together, although they will not always be. And now let's transition into actual cooldown usage. This could all sound a little bit complicated, and it really is the key to optimizing Fury Warrior. The reality is, the goal is to sync up Ravager, Recklessness, and Spear of Bastion as often as humanly possible, because Recklessness will grant us both the Avatar and Recklessness buff through our talent at the bottom left of our class tree, and Ravager gives us the Hurricane buff, which buffs the shit out of our strength and makes us deal massive damage. Combining all 3 of those things together inside of Spear of Bastion with our bonus crit will deal absolutely massive damage. Now, 2 of these cooldowns are on 1 minute 30 cycles, those being Spear of Bastion and Avatar, and 2 of these cooldowns are on a very different cycle. They have a minute 30 base cooldown, however, they get reduced by Anger Management, which is a talent that reduces the cooldown of them based on how much rage we have. If you're in combat the entire time, you can get them to an average of about a 30-second cooldown if you're playing extremely well. Generally, it'll be a little bit longer than 30 seconds, which causes some lineups to be very difficult. And so there's a lot of decision making when it comes to trying to sync up our cooldowns to play as optimally as possible. One other key part of our cooldowns is the talent at the bottom left of our class tree that grants us Avatar for pressing Recklessness and Recklessness for pressing Avatar. This enables us to effectively treat Rec and Avatar as kind of the same thing. Neither is really better than the other. Avatar has higher duration, but Recklessness comes up more often. And so as long as you have both of these buffs for the rest of your cooldowns, then you're doing fine. So you can do a full cooldown damage cycle with either of these up. One other small thing to note is that pressing Recklessness will extend the duration of Avatar that's already active, but pressing Avatar will not extend the duration of an existing Avatar. And so that means you always want, when you're writing a macro to put Recklessness and Avatar together, you always want to cast Avatar first and Recklessness second. What this looks like in a real situation, if you have all 4 cooldowns available, is you first press Avatar to gain Recklessness and Avatar buffed, Then you press Recklessness to extend both of those buffs, and then you would press Ravager to start building your Hurricane buff. You would wait about 2 seconds or 2 global cooldowns about, and then you would send your Spear of Bastion at your feet, also hitting the mobs in front of you, and you would start absolutely slamming your normal rotation, dealing as much damage as humanly possible. Now, for lining up cooldowns, my general rule of thumb is if Recklessness and Avatar have more than 30 seconds remaining, I will just send Avatar and Spear of Bastion alone on their own cycle. If they have less than 30 seconds remaining, I will send Avatar immediately to try and get them up faster, and I will hold my Spear of Bastion for about 10 seconds maximum, which is about 30 seconds remaining on the cooldown, accounting for anger management. I will hold Spear of Bastion until I get Recklessness and Ravager up, and then I would press Recklessness and Ravager, wait 2 seconds, throw my Spear of Bastion. To optimize DPS, it is important to line up Ravager with Spear of Bastion as often as possible, but you do not ever want to hold your Spear of Bastion for an extended period of time. Now, with all that out of the way, I'm going to talk about our tier set in patch 10.1. The first part of the tier set is just a flat damage and crit chance increase for Rampage. Very boring, just a flat % damage increase, basically. Our 4-set bonus gives us a stacking buff every time we press Rampage, which will buff our next Bloodthirst to have higher crit chance, higher damage, and higher rage generation. What this means is that when the buff gets stacked high enough, Bloodthirst will almost always crit and deal a bunch of damage. This means that we want to track our tier set stacks and press Bloodthirst, generally above 5 stacks, because it will almost guaranteed crit, and there's a talent in our tree called Cold Steel Hot Blood, which applies a gushing wound every time Bloodthirst crits, which deals a quite large amount of damage. So once you're above 5 stacks on the tier set, it is worth it to press Bloodthirst and get that free crit with extra damage. And so it changes our single target rotation priority to number 1, press Rampage, number 2, press Bloodthirst with over 5 stacks of our tier set, and continue the rest as normal. Hello, welcome to the actual rotation section of the guide. Before I get into actually pressing the opener and showing you the exact rotations in-game, I just want to briefly mention what we built up in the last section. So you can see on the left side, we have our rotation priority. This is when you're just pressing your buttons and dealing damage, the order you want to press your things in. So number 1 is the highest priority, and you will always press it if it's available, going down the list to the lowest priority. And then on the right side here, I have some tips for cooldown usage that I discussed in the previous part of the video. If you have questions regarding these, feel free to watch the previous sections or ask me down in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer. But yeah, generally the goal of Fury Warrior is to line up Spear of Bastion with as many other cooldowns as possible, as often as possible, and that is the key to doing the most damage you can. So with that, let's get into the opener. Starting with the single target opener, I'll just be rotating on the dummy. If you're using puzzle blocks, you pop it before the pull. If you're using another trinket, you can just macro it in with your Recklessness and Avatar. So we first pop our trinket, and then we charge Bloodthirst to get rage up, Ravager, pop our cooldowns, spend 2 globals, and then we Spear of Bastion with our full Hurricane buff, and just keep pressing our priority. Execute when it's available, Rampage as much as possible, pressing Onslaught when we can, and just using our priority list. And that's the single target opener. After that, you just continue your regular rotation to infinity and try and line up your cooldowns as often as possible. Never hold Spear of Bastion for more than 10 seconds. Now, the actual gameplay change you make for your tier set in this patch does not come up often in your rotation, because Bloodthirst is in our normal priority list and it gets pressed pretty often. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where you have 4 to 5 stacks of your tier set bonus and you're not pressing Bloodthirst, you want to give it priority over Onslaught and just send Bloodthirst, because we want to get Gushing Wound on the target as often as we can. I would highly recommend that you track your tier set stacks in some way, whether that's using the weekly I have linked down in the description or just looking at your buffs. But it is very important that you track this buff, Merciless Assault, and press your tier set when you're at 5 stacks or more. Moving into the AOE opener for Fury Warrior, it is extremely similar to the single target opener. The only difference is you throw a Whirlwind as your first global, and you Whirlwind every 5th global to maintain your buff. And so it looks a little something like this. Send your trinket, charge in Whirlwind, get in rage up, press your cooldowns, spend 2 globals, and then we Spear of Bastion and continue our rotation as normal, Whirlwinding whenever we run out of our buff. You'd say I actually made a mistake there and overcapped my rage by not pressing Rampage as soon as it was available. And I have stacks of my tier set, so I'm going to spend them. And yeah, that's really it. Just continue your rotation priority, Whirlwinding every 5th global. It's the only change in AoE. As a brief note, if you are using the Thunderous Roar variation of the build instead of Spear of Bastion, it does not change anything about your actual rotations. Thunderous Roar fits into the exact same slot as Spear of Bastion and follows all of the same rules. You want to line it up with Ravager, Recklessness, and Avatar as often as possible. But yeah, I can just go through the opener really quick, just so you can see the amount of damage it puts out. Press our cooldowns, wait 2 seconds for Hurricane buff, send Thunderous Roar exactly like we would Spear of Bastion, and just continue our rotation. Yeah. Very, very similar opener, not substantially different in any way. As a final note, I want to briefly mention all the utility Fury Warrior has access to. One of the most powerful buttons in our kit is Spell Reflection. It is a flat 20% magic DR on a 25-second cooldown, and can also spell reflect different mechanics throughout dungeons and raids. It is very powerful and really should be used as often as possible. Even if you're not spell reflecting anything, a 20% DR on a 25-second cooldown is insanely broken. Next up, we have Impending Victory. This is a really, really strong heal. It is the go-to panic button if I'm ever getting low. It's only 1 global cooldown and heals me for a massive 30% HP. Definitely use this very often whenever you're taking damage. Next up, we have Stormbolt. This is a stun. Very, very useful in keys. Solid 30-second cooldown, just stun a single enemy. And you really do not have to give up anything at all to take it in the Fury Warrior tree. Next up, we have Intimidating Shout. If you want to pick up Intimidating Shout for your keys, I would recommend dropping Seismic Reverberation. That is just the most logical choice, as it really does not add much damage to our Whirlwind. Intimidating Shout is just a 2-minute cooldown, 5 target fear. One tip for this button is because it's target capped, you really need to be targeting the enemy you want to make sure it gets feared. And also, a lot of enemies happen to be immune to fear, which kind of sucks, but if you need the CC, Intimidating Shout is valuable. And last but not least, we have Enraged Regeneration, which is our primary defensive as a Fury Warrior. It is a 2-minute cooldown, 30% damage reduction, so fairly powerful standard personal. And in addition to that, whenever we press Bloodthirst inside of Enraged Regen, we gain an additional 20% health, which pretty much makes Fury Warrior into a tank for its duration. You can really just self-heal yourself an absolutely massive amount if you're pressing Bloodthirst inside of the Enraged Regen window. Very rarely should you need to do this, but it can save you in a pinch. And that concludes my 10.1 Fury Warrior guide. If you have any questions about anything I talked about in this video, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to answer. And I hope you have the best of time blasting DPS in this upcoming patch. See you guys later.